for as long as there is history, people have been observing the height of celestial bodies and doing latitude sailing, all the way back to and before, the Polynesian navigators. The tools got much, much better with the sextant.
A sextant is a way for you to measure the curvature of the Earth and your location to the stars, so you can determine where in the heck you are.
The advances in electronics and navigational electronics have made sailing more accessible for people who aren't necessarily that comfortable with figuring out how to get from point A to point B without hitting rocks and things like that. That used to be a challenge. You used to need charts, you used to need sextants, you used to need to be able to chart a course, figure out what the compass heading was from point A to point B.
With the miniaturization of electronics and the technology advancements in miniature electronics, we went from I'm guessing to I know.
There's a ton of change happening on the cutting edge of technology in the America's Cup. And there's, enormous advances that are happening every single day and every, leap and bound that goes there. But the first person that comes to mind when I think about who's changed the face of technology in the sport of sailing is Stan Honey. The influence that he's had on, especially in the last 20 years over the way that the sport thinks about technology. What's the value of it? What could it do for sailors?
Even electronics happened. There was DECA and LORAN and Omega, and then the transit sat-nav system, and now, of course, the GPS. And now with other international constellations, we call it GNSS. But through that whole phase of electronics, the position determination problem vanished. That used to be, 2/3 of my job is just figuring out where you were, finding the marks and staying off the bricks. And that whole 2/3 of the job disappeared, and then all of the job became route selection. Figuring out what the best weather forecasts were, figuring out the performance of the boat, and therefore figuring out what the fastest course to take was.
Stan, of course, is a hero in sailing, and he has created the visual impact, I believe, that broadcast technology needs for promoting the sport.
Watching sailboat races on TV was always fun for the few of us that sort of could really figure out what was going on, but it wasn't really until the overlays, the graphics overlays started coming online in the 2013 Cup in San Francisco that all of a sudden it was a lot easier to tell, and a lot easier for people who weren't really hardcore sailors to be able to watch it on TV. Computers can do a lot of things now that computers didn't used to be able to do. The processing power is pretty astounding, and our ability now to model the effects of fluid dynamics on boats, on appendages, on sails is now just sort of advancing at an unheard of rate.
CFD tools are fascinating. I mean, they're a huge help, to the design teams that are working on new boats. But those design teams also have to be careful, and there's still lots of room for human insight because those tools sometimes miss.
Sailboats are really tricky engineering problems. They are moving through two different fluids, obviously air and water.
That plane is the difficulty in CFD. Wind-driven waves, you have current-driven waves, you have the wakes of the boat and the other things. The air doesn't just stop at one plane and the water doesn't stop at one plane. There's a whole mixing zone, and that's a really big deal. That's a really big deal.
And our ability to be able to get more of a handle on those things makes us able to sail boats faster, and the boats also get a lot safer in the process.
The CFD often showed that foiling had too much induced drag. And there was a lot of very good designers who didn't think foiling was going to work because of the induced drag that the CFD predicted. And yet foiling worked much better than anyone could have imagined or than any of the CFD had predicted.
There's two sides of sailing, right? There's the water then there's an interface between water and air, and then there's the air. And CFD can do that whole regime. It can also do the parts individually and be brought together. But it is probably the major advance in sailing performance that has happened on a technology and design side. So now, before a boat is built, you used to have to build a model of it, test it in water, and you made predictions on its performance. Now, you can do all that in a computer.
Nobody, even 10 years ago, based on the CFD at the time, could have imagined that foiling would work as well as it does. And so I think CFD is a terrific tool, and it's of course getting upgraded so that it wouldn't now miss that narrow boats win in the IACC class, and it now would correctly predict that foiling actually works.
You can use a foiling kiteboard or a foiling windsurfer in lighter air than you could boats that didn't foil. So the foils are making a big difference in the recent years in the performance of boats and the accessibility to folks who want speed in order to get out on that water.
People tried foiling way back in the 70s. It wasn't really successful because the rest of the technology hadn't caught up to it yet. One of the things that crushed the Navy programs was being able to build something that was light enough to foil at a reasonable power. Well, that's exactly what's happened in sailing, is we were finally able to build hulls in materials that made them light enough and still strong enough to reduce the weight that had to be lifted.
When we all first saw the video of the Team New Zealand catamaran foiling, most people's first reaction was, that's got to be photoshopped in some way, shape, or form. That 80 plus foot catamaran can't actually be foiling, can it? The advances in controls and how we sort of can bring foiling mainstream. It's been 9 years since we saw that video, and it's amazing to think about what's happened during those 9 years.